Good evening, y'all, and welcome to this second reading of Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Last time we did manage to finish chapter 1, so we'll be able to start chapter 2 today. As always, if you're here with us in the live reading of Neo-colonialism, the PDF to be able to join us is in the pinned section of the Discord, and of course, if you're watching on YouTube, then that means that you can still follow along, and the PDF is going to be in the description for y'all, as well as any relevant links that we end up referencing. So, without further ado, so let's get started. Speaking of West Africa, 1962, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa pointed out, few other regions of the world show such a multitude of fairly small states, both as far as production and population go. The only similar region of some importance is Central America. West Africa is in fact divided into 19 separate independent states and includes 2 colonial enclaves possessed by Spain and Portugal. The population of the area is about a third of the total population of Africa, yet the average population of the independent countries, if Nigeria is included, is about 2 to 3 million. It is, however, illusory to regard even Nigeria as an exception to the balkanization policy practiced by the departing colonial rulers. The constitution imposed on Nigeria at independence divided the country into 3 regions, which have since grown into 4, loosely joined on a federal basis, but with sufficient powers left to the regions to cripple overall economic planning. If the other states of West Africa are examples of political balkanization, Nigeria is an example of economic balkanization. Ghana, with a population of over 7 million, only escaped a similar fate by the resistance put up by the Convention People's Party government to a British plan which created no less than 5 regions, some with a population of less than 1 million, yet each possessing sufficient powers to defeat central plan. Kenya, which was also forced to accept at independence a similar type of constitution, has only recently been able to establish a unified regime. When France was faced with the possibility of being forced to accept some form of independence, or at least self-government for the territories of the old colonial federations of West and Equatorial Africa, a series of balkanization measures were adopted by the French government. The Loy Cadre of 1956 established the frontiers of the present French-speaking states. The dismantling process began by the Loy Cadre was completed by the referendum of 1958 on the Constitution of the French Fifth Republic. Each of the territories established by the Loy Cadre was called upon to decide separately whether it wished to remain an overseas territory of France, an autonomous republic within the French community, or to be independent. Teresa Hayter, a research assistant at the British Overseas Development Institute, in the April 1965 issue of the Journal of the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, has described the process. The territories were to make separate decisions. It was therefore they, and not the federations of West and Equatorial Africa, which were legally to inherit France's powers. No provision was made for strengthening the federal institutions, and in fact they were dismantled after the referendum and came formally to an end in April 1959. The original purpose of the federations had been to enable the colonies to pay for themselves through a reallocation of their revenues. Senghor, in particular, has bitterly accused France of balkanizing Africa in the Loy Cadre. With the choice so loaded, only Guinea voted against the constitution. All the others became autonomous republics, members of the Franco-African community. Fearing that the example of Guinea might be followed by other states which had decided to join the community, the French government removed everything of value from the territory. Administrators and teachers were withdrawn. Documents and even electric light bulbs were removed from government buildings. Financial assistance, trade support, and the payment of pensions to Guinean war veterans were discontinued. Despite the pressure placed on Guinea in this way, the remaining French states were forced by internal pressure to seek political independence. This destroyed the conception usually associated with General de Gaulle, the originator of the French community, of a non-sovereign group of African states, each separately linked to France. One after another, the autonomous republics obtained international sovereignty, but under such adverse conditions that they had, in fact, to maintain all the military, financial, commercial, and economic links of the previous colonial period. In order to exist at all as independent states, these former French territories were forced to accept French aid, even to meet their recurring expenses. It's just real wild how like these themes of like conscripted terms, even under like conditions of like independence, like still end up like popping up in terms of like France and what it inflicts on countries. Haiti being like a prime example. We're talking about all these different African nations forced to accept these different French terms just to have autonomy and independence recognized politically. Like this is like seeming to come up with France in particular, over and over again. So we'll see how that works out as we continue to read through the book. So French aid to developing countries is, in proportion to the French national income, the highest in the world, and is in absolute terms the second highest. Nearly all of this aid is absorbed by commitments in Africa, and nearly half of it goes to the 14 states which were previously autonomous republic and whose combined population is only slightly larger than that of Nigeria. Aid of this type can dictate African relations with the developed world and, as experience has shown, can be extremely dangerous to the recipients. French African aid originally arose from the advantage which French firms and individuals derived from the African franc zone, and this has determined the framework in which the aid is still provided. So long as the relationship which the aid provided was profitable to France, it naturally continued. It was in effect a levy on French taxpayers for the benefit of French individuals and firms. The overall value of the policy to France was that in return for guaranteed markets and prices for colonial primary products such as coffee, cocoa, groundnuts, bananas, and cotton, the African states had to import from France fixed quantities of certain goods, such as machinery, textiles, sugar, and flour, which were then uncompetitive in price or surplus in Europe. And in addition, the states were forced to limit their imports from countries outside the franc zone. While this scheme made no sense of any plan for inter-African trade, it was for a period highly profitable to France. Literally talking about the idea of so-called negotiations in trade and finance that are supposedly mutually beneficial, but blatantly, disproportionately only make sense for the colonizing country and, not the colonized countries conscripted into these so-called deals in the first place. So that makes sense for inter-African trade, or no sense for inter-African trade, and is highly profitable to France. With the fall in the world price of primary commodities, these profits began to diminish, as did enthusiasm for aid in France. At the present moment, the most which can be said in favor of French aid is that it does not, as it did in the past, make an actual profit for France from the less developed states of its former African empire. Teresa Hayter sums it up. Quote, France does not gain in transactions with the states, nor does it lose. Aid, private investment, French government expenditures, and imports from them are balanced by exports to them, repatriation of capital, and remittances, profits, and salaries. Close quote. This state of affairs is considered to be no longer of value to France. The January report, published in 1964 and expressing the official French view, pointed out that the protective system of the French zone was no longer in the interest of France, and the report therefore advocated the redeployment of French aid. In any event, France had to comply with her obligations to the European Common Market. Under the new Convention of Association, which came into force in the summer of 1964, the 6 members of the European Common Market are to achieve in stages a free trade area, and this will no longer make it possible for France to discriminate in favor of the African states, nor for these states to discriminate against France's common market partners. Exports from these states will, by the end of a 5-year period, have to be aligned to world prices. In consequence, the primary production, which they have built up on the strength of the promise of guaranteed markets and prices, is likely to fail to be competitive in world conditions. It is difficult to see how Senegal, in particular, can manage with the French subsidy for her groundnuts. And President Senghor has already called attention to the serious economic position into which this puts his country. In fact, the limited neo-colonialism to the French period is now being merged in the collective neo-colonialism of the European common market, which enables other states, hitherto outside the French preserve, to profit by the system. It also rationalizes the different division of Africa into economic zones based upon Europe by drawing in four other states. The Congo, Leopoldville, Burundi, and Rwanda are, as previous Belgian colonies, tied to the Belgian economic system. And Somalia, through its previous association with Italy, is also brought in as an associated state of the common market. A grouping such as this raises the wider problems of African neocolonialism and emphasizes its irresponsible nature. Of the states carved out of the former French colonies, one, Guinea, has been able, with great suffering, and loses to its true to cut free from the type of neo-colonialist control imposed on the others. Mali has been forced to accept some of the rules and regulations which govern the relations of the former French colonies to France. But at least she has set up her own currency, limits transfers of money abroad, and receives from France only a partial guarantee of the parity of her currency with the French franc. In the course of all the other states, their currencies have been stabilized on a fixed parity with the French franc and have a total guarantee from the French treasury. These states pay their receipts of French francs into operation accounts in the French treasury. These accounts can be withdrawn, and the states can draw on them against their own currencies to an unlimited extent. Obviously, however, whatever the theoretical position, the international financial position of these countries is subject to control in that at any time their operation accounts in the French treasury could be blocked, as was done in the case of Guinea. Most, at any rate, of the states concerned lacked the strength to stand up against such pressure, as was often the case, as did Guinea. Why then, it may be asked, are these powers not sufficient to enable France to persuade these states to follow present French foreign policy, which is based upon a third force concept? France did not support the United States and Belgium in their so-called humanitarian intervention at Stanleyville in the Congo. Unlike Britain and the other common market countries, France has openly opposed the U.S. policy in Santo Domingo, has recognized the People's Republic of China, and has recommended the neutralization of Vietnam. Yet only a minority of the African states, which would appear to be under French neo-colonial control, have followed the French line. The majority of them refuse to recognize China or in any way criticize U.S. policy. Indeed, they behave in a fashion suggestive of being under U.S. Rather than French influence. The answer to this apparent paradox will, I believe, be found in the following chapters of this book, in which I attempt to explain the power and ramifications of international financial control. Here, one has a superstate which can at times even override the policies, the policy wishes of the nominal neo-colonial master. The control of the funds of the French neo-colonial African states is exercised by the administrative council of their central banks, which are composed partly of Frenchmen, without whose agreement no decision in monetary policy can be taken. This French banking complex, with its absolute control of the currencies and external payments of the French neo-colonial states, could, in theory, dictate that these states follow a French policy. However, the complex is itself subject, in the manner later described, to external pressures which support United States rather than French policies, where a difference of opinions arise. So that's really interesting. He's talking about this idea that even though nominally you would expect that subjugated African countries who are in a coercive agreement with France would expect, based on their relationship to French capital, to acquiesce to the whims of French foreign policy, but that the French banking system, the French finance economic system, is itself entangled in a complex relationship with the greater overall imperialist structure, which necessarily then means that not only does it come to disagreements between different factions of the international bourgeoisie, but that those disagreements necessarily play out in a material way of having subjugated countries sometimes have to openly oppose what it is a country that they're supposed to necessarily be allies with, and necessarily end up allying with a different colonizer, with a different colonizing country. In this case, the U.S. So it's very complicated. He says he'll explain how those particular relationships develop and what makes them so complicated, and so that we can attempt to try to understand exactly why things are as they are. Part of the value of commencing a study of neo-colonialism in its African context is that it provides examples of every type of system. It is impossible to define the African situation in terms of independent states divided into the non-aligned and the neo-colonialist camp. Colonies and racialist states such as South Africa and Africa all form colonies which have now become independent, including particularly South Africa, are subject to some degree to neo-colonialist pressures, with however much they wish to resist, they cannot entirely escape, struggle as they may. The difference in reality is between those states that accept neo-colonialism as a policy and those which resist it. Similarly, the colonial problems of Africa is in many ways really neo-colonial. The Portuguese African territories appear at first sight only to raise the issue of freedom from colonial rule, but in fact they exist as colonies only because Portugal is itself a neo-colonial state. For the last 50 years, the great powers have regarded the Portuguese colonies as counters, which they can exchange between themselves in order to readjust the balance of power. In 1913, the British and Germans had initialed an agreement for their division, and this was only prevented by the outbreak of the First World War. In the appeasement period prior to the Second World War, when it was thought that Hitler could be brought off by an offer of colonial territory, the Portuguese colonies were again regarded as the suitable bride. Does anybody want to take over reading about 5 or 6 pages for a little bit?
I can do it.
Appreciate it, Conrad. Yeah.
If Portugal controls these colonies now, it is only because of the military strength which she derives from her NATO alliance. Portugal is, however, not a member of NATO because of any military assistance which she could render the alliance, but because this is a convenient way by which Portuguese territory can be made available to the forces of other members of the alliance. At the other end of the scale is the French colony of Somalia. It continues to exist as a colony not because France would resist pressure to grant it independence, but because of African disunity. It is a point of dispute between Somalia and Ethiopia. African disunity maintains this colony. If it were to go to either of its neighbors, it would almost inevitably provoke a conflict between them. Rhodesia, while theoretically a colony, is really a fossilized form of the earliest type of neo-colonialism, which was practiced in southern Africa until the formation of the Union of South Africa. The essence of the Rhodesia system is not to employ individuals drawn from the people of the territory itself to run the country, as in the newer type of neo-colonial state, but to utilize instead an alien minority. The majority of the European ruling class of Rhodesia only came to the colony after the Second World War, but it is they and not the African inhabitants, who outnumber them 16-1, that Britain regards as the government. This racialist state is protected from outside pressure because under international law, it is a British colony, while Britain herself excuses her failure to exercise her legal rights to prevent the oppression and exploitation of the African inhabitants, of which, of course, she officially disapproves because of a supposed British parliamentary convention. In other words, by maintaining Rhodesia nominally as a colony, Britain in effect gives her official protection as a second South Africa, and the European racialists are left free to treat the African inhabitants as they will. The Rhodesian system thus has all the hallmarks of the neo-colonial model. The patron power Britain awards to a local government over which it claims to have no control, unlimited rights, and exploitation within the territory, yet Britain still retains powers to exclude other countries from intervening, either to liberate its African population or to bring its economy into some other zone of influence. The maneuvering over Rhodesia's independence is an excellent example of the workings of neocolonialism and the practical difficulties to which the system gives rise. A European minority of less than quarter of a million could not maintain, in the conditions of Africa today, rule over 4 million Africans without external support from somewhere. While the settlers talk of independence, they are not thinking of standing on their own feet, but merely of seeking a new neo-colonialist master who would, in their view, be more reliable than Britain. As will be seen from the chapters which follow, modern neocolonialism is based upon the control of nominally independent states by giant financial interests. These interests often act through or on behalf of a particular capitalist state, but they are quite capable of acting on their own and forcing those imperial countries in which they have a dominant interest to follow their lead. There is, however, an older type of neocolonialism which is based primarily on military considerations. A world power, having decided on principles of global strategy that it is necessary to have a military base in this or that nominally independent country, must ensure that the country where the base is situated is friendly. Here is another reason for balkanization. If the base can be situated in a country which is so constituted economically that it cannot survive without substantial aid from the military power which owns the base, then, so it is argued, the security of the base can be assured. Like so many other of the assumptions on which neocolonialism is based, this one is false. The presence of foreign bases arouses popular hostility to the neocolonial arrangements which permit them more quickly and more surely than does anything else. And throughout Africa, these bases are disappearing. Libya may be quoted as an example of how this policy has failed. Libya has had a long colonial history. From the 16th century onwards, it was a Turkish colony, but in 1900, in the heyday of colonialism, France and Italy agreed that if Italy would not oppose France occupying Morocco, France would not oppose Italy occupying Libya. So when in 1911 and 1912 France was occupying Morocco, Italy went to war with Turkey and, defeating her, annexed Libya. Despite promises during the Second World War to the people of Libya that they would never again be subjected to Italian rule, France tried at the peace settlement to have Italy reinstalled in order to support her own position in Tunisia. This solution proving impossible, Libya became nominally independent, but actually under British neo-colonial control. According to the figures collated by the British Overseas Development Institute, during the period 1945 to 1963, Libya received no less than 17% of the total bilateral aid which Britain gave to all foreign countries outside the Commonwealth in that period. The Overseas Development Institute notes that although these payments to Libya are counted as aid, there is no doubt that they are in essence straightforward payments to the Libyan government in return for the use of bases. Nevertheless, popular pressure in Libya has now made it necessary for the Libyan government to terminate the military agreement for British bases. These limitations on the real independence of many countries in Africa should not be allowed to obscure the very great achievements already gained in the struggle for African independence and unity. In 1945, Africa largely comprised the colonial territories of European powers, and the idea that the greater part of the continent would be independent within 20 years would have seemed impossible to any political observer in the immediate post-war period. Yet, not only has independence been achieved, but considerable progress has been made towards the establishment of African unity. To this unity, there are still powerful obstacles, but they are no greater than the obstacles already overcome, and if their nature is understood, they are clearly surmountable. Already, and this will ultimately be the decisive factor, the mass of the African people support unity in the same way as they previously supported the various local movements for political independence. Many of the political leaders of French West Africa, for example, did not at first support independence. In 1946, in the French National Assembly, of which he was then a member, Houphouët-Boigny, the president of the Ivory Coast, claimed there are no separatists on these benches. There is a powerful bond capable of resisting all tests, a moral bond which unites us all. It is the ideal of liberty, fraternity, equality, for whose triumph France has never hesitated to sacrifice its most noble blood. Jesus. The same policy of the maintenance of unity with France was also supported at the time by President Senghor of Senegal, who said, "The French Union must be a conjunction of civilizations, a melting pot of cultures. It is a marriage rather than an association." It is a mass pressure for independence that forced these leaders to reverse their previous positions and to declare themselves in favor of national sovereignty. In the same way as mass pressure made it impossible for an African leader to oppose independence, so today mass pressure makes it impossible for him to openly oppose African unity. Those who are against it can only show their opposition in indirect ways, by suggesting that the pace towards it is too fast, that this or that plan is impractical, or that there are procedural difficulties which prevent them from assisting in formulating a practical plan for it. The case for African unity is very strong and the instinct of the mass of people right. It is only when the official boundaries that divide her are broken down so as to provide for viable economic units, and ultimately a single African unit, that Africa will be able to develop industrially for her own sake, and ultimately for the sake of a healthy world economy. The common currency is needed, and communications of all kinds must be developed to allow the free flow of goods and services. The Economic Commission for Africa has repeatedly emphasized the need for economic planning on a continental scale. The inadequacy of national planning can be demonstrated by a glance at the economies of, for example, Mali, the Upper Volta, Niger, and Uganda. These landlocked states, which export large quantities of food products over to other African states, cannot remain indifferent to the agricultural self-sufficiency schemes adopted by their neighbors. Similarly, a national government planning the establishment of a new industry may find that a neighboring state is developing one like it. Such duplication would probably result in wasted resources if each were depending on exporting its surplus to its neighbor. Few would argue against the need for economic planning on a national scale. How much stronger is the argument for continental planning? The modern trend is towards larger economic and political units as interdependence of nations and peoples grows. No country can be completely self-sufficient or afford to ignore political events outside its borders. Africa is clearly fragmented into too many small, uneconomic, and non-viable states, many of whom are having a very hard struggle to survive. As already noted, others have had to cling to the old ties with former colonial rulers and have become easy prey to neo-colonialist forces. Some of them have found themselves, whether they liked it or not, drawn into the Cold War and into the rivalries between foreign powers. The Congo is a notable example. Naturally, each national government is concerned primarily with the welfare of its own citizens. It can only be expected to agree to a policy of unification if the immediate and long-term benefits became so apparent that it would be positively damaging to its citizens not to cooperate. We are faced here with the problem of uneven economic growth. Some African countries are richer in natural resources than others. The less fortunate will need reassuring that their interest will not suffer at the hands of the more developed states. Past economic union experience has not been encouraging. The linking of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland benefited chiefly southern Rhodesia. Kenya had gained principally from the East Africa Common Market, Uganda and Tanganyika being at best only marginal gainers. In the former French colonial federations, the benefits of economic unity tended to center in Brazzaville, Abidjan, and Dakar. These examples further strengthen the argument for continentally planned economic growth so that all states can benefit from industrialization and other improvements made possible by unified direction. The richer countries will be able to help the poorer. Resources can be pooled and development projects coordinated to raise the living standards of every African. The time factor is important. As ECA has pointed out, now is the time to act before each state gets too deeply involved in major investment and national decisions based on narrow national markets. With each month that passes, the foreign interests of neo-colonialism get a tighter grip on Africa's economic life. The comparatively recent penetration of American big business into Africa points once again to the danger of neo-colonialism. So also does the combining of large firms to form powerful monopolies. How can some of our smaller states hope to bargain successfully with powerful foreign combines, some of which control financial empires worth more than the state's total revenue? The smaller the state, the more formidable the foreign interests. The less likely are the conditions for economic independence to be met. For example, Ghana, because of its economic size and alternative industries, has been in a stronger position for bargaining with the aluminum companies than much smaller and economically more limited Togo can hope to be in dealing with French phosphate interests. The domination of Africa's economy by foreign firms must be ended if we are to achieve rounded economic growth, and this can only be done through unified action. Something in the nature of an economic revolution is required. Our development has been held back for too long by the colonial-type economy. We need to reorganize entirely so that each country can specialize in producing the goods and crops for which it is best suited. With economic unity, those countries in Africa which are beginning to establish modern industries would benefit from wider markets. We would all be in a better bargaining position to obtain higher prices for our goods and to establish adequate taxation of foreign factor earnings. In fact, a whole new pattern of economic development would be made possible. Agriculture could be modernized more quickly with more capital at its disposal. Industries on a larger and more economic scale could be planned. These could afford to make use of new techniques involving heavy capital outlay. Smaller plants planned to meet only national needs are likely to have higher costs and are eventually less able to reduce costs than optimum-sized units. National planning bodies would still have a very important part to play in a unified Africa. They would, for example, supply essential information from local conditions, but their work would be made easier with the experienced advice and help of a single planning body keeping an eye on Africa's interests as a whole. The research and training in development projects already being carried out by the ECA Development Institute in Dakar would be strengthened to serve both the continental and national bodies. Expensive failures due to lack of coordination would be avoided. A case in point is the Inga Dam project, which is to provide power for a sugar refinery, a plastics and hardboard from sugarcane waste complex in Bangui, which in turn will ship bulk plastics to a plastic products industry in Brazzaville. Obviously, there should be a planning body able to phase and harmonize construction timing for the Brazzaville and Bangui plants, the power lines from Inga to Bangui and Brazzaville, and the transportation services between Bangui and Brazzaville and the dam itself. In the process of obtaining economic unity, there is bound to be much hard bargaining between the various states. Integration of different aspects of economic policy will proceed at different rates, and there may be disappointing delays and compromises to be worked out. But given the will to succeed, difficulties can be resolved. In general, the broader the front on which economic unity is launched, the quicker the goals and policies for a fully developed Africa can be achieved. An all-African planning body could take immediate steps towards the development of large-scale industry and power, for the removal of barriers to inter-African trade, and for the creation of a central bank and the formation of a unified policy on all aspects of export control, tariff, and quota arrangements. The ECA has carried out several surveys designed to provide information to help in the making of decisions on these points. Among immediate needs are the manufacture in Africa of agricultural machinery of all kinds to speed up the modernization of agriculture. We need supplies of electrical equipment for use in growing electric power production essential for industrial growth. Mining and industrial machinery must be produced in Africa to lower the cost of developing our mineral resources. Construction machinery and supplies, chemicals, fertilizers, plastics are all urgently required, and Africa must produce them for her own requirements. Reports of the ECA industrial coordination missions to different regions in Africa suggest that the production of iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, engineering supplies, chemicals and fertilizers, cement, paper, and textiles should be developed on an inter-African basis since their efficiency depends on large-scale production. Other industries which can run efficiently on a smaller scale can be planned nationally. The location of the various industries will, of course, depend on many factors such as availability of power, mineral deposits, nearness to processing plants, markets, and so on. Production of aluminum and copper, for example, will have to be developed in those countries where the essential resources, ore, and cheap power are available. The manufacturing of aluminum and copper products, however, need not take place in the countries producing the metals. Similarly, the production of cotton is limited to certain climatic regions, while cotton textile industries can be developed further afield. Every African state has some contribution to make to the economic whole. There are, for instance, no known deposits of potash in West Africa, but requirements can be met from North Africa, Ethiopia, and possibly also from the Congo, Brazzaville, and Gabon. Plans for nitrogenous fertilizer production in Zambia have already been worked out. The plant could be supplied with coal from Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and low-cost power from the Victoria Falls. Kenya, with its large forest reserves, could become the center of a wood distillation complex able to supply the countries of East and Central Africa with gas, acetone, methanol, and tar. There are many examples too numerous to describe.
Thank you, Comrade Dictionary. So, I mean, there's a lot going on here. Like, so one of the things Emily and I had worked out to discuss is this question of does Africa have the natural resources necessary to be able to centrally plan? I mean, and the answer is clearly yes. Not only are the resources there to be able to centrally plan, but like at least theoretically, there's a plan to execute it if African countries ever wanted to unite. We're right at the end here talking about what was it? Plans for nitrogenous fertilizer production in Zambia being worked out. Talking about the plant being supplied with coal from Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, low cost power, and he's going into the idea that there's like way too few examples to talk about like which African nations could contribute to which aspect of the entire continent's development, if she were one. So like this idea that, well, Africa is like too backwards and like it could never, without colonial influence, be self-sufficient is to say the very to put it in the kindest words, absolute horseshit that doesn't bear out to any kind of material reality at all. What were your thoughts on some of that you were reading, Comrade Dictionary, as they talk about having the apparatus in place to centrally plan if they could get themselves out from the colonial situation? What were some of your thoughts?
Some of the things I was thinking about while I was reading this were like, I know that Nkrumah was a socialist, but if you didn't, you could just like read this as like a plan that I think people would just accept. I mean, this is centralized planning of an economy on a continental scale, as he describes, but like, I think you could get a lot of people who would be immediately hostile to the idea of socialism on board with a lot of these ideas because they make good sense. Like, it's hard to read any of this and think, well, that's a bad idea. I'm just like, yeah, that makes total sense to me. Of course that should happen. It's a shame that the West is going to get in the way. And something that this chapter, I think, especially kind of blew me away with the first time I read it was like the description of how the Western powers would like carve up the nations into smaller sections that could really support themselves so that they were still stuck getting aid because that's so like insidious. And you can see how people would be like, yeah, we're getting free, and like not realize right away that it's just a different kind of control.
Mm-hmm.
And it also like is a very good point to make to any of these weird balkanized United States people.
Oh, looking at you, Eric Arbor. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's real. So like in terms of like what were you noticing seemed to be some of the barriers to continental central planning in Africa? Like what jumped out at you as like maybe the two or three different problems that might be barriers to the continental central planning?
Well, I think the underpinning problem is that the West is going to interfere, right?
Right.
And I think we can all sort of agree that that's going to be their biggest problem is imperialism. But putting that aside, right? Just looking at the continent itself and imagining a world where the West did not ruin everything, I think you could see that like there's certainly going to be, as he discusses, some concerns between like the smaller states and the larger states over like how do people get a reasonable amount, right? Like how do
Mm-hmm.
they survive? How do they make sure that they don't get trampled on by the larger states and such? Which obviously we would be like, well, have you heard about socialism? So that's like I think a big one is how do you do that? And then the sort of entrenched nature of the already existing states, right? Like if you're the president of, let's say, Gabon, like do you really want to give up power to this central authority because of all the possible things you might get without it? Like you're gonna lose some power and potentially some standing, even though it's going to benefit your people, but it might not benefit you as much because, you're getting all those kickbacks, as we know politicians get. So I think that would probably be like a big concern, is how do you convince people who have power to maybe give up some of it for the good of everyone?
Yeah, that's a really strong point. Another thing that I found interesting, and this comes from like I guess the first third, because this chapter is could be probably broken down in thirds. So that the first third was like mentioning this idea that like even different African nations have like different perspectives on who it's even beneficial to work with, and like whether or not, because the situation is obviously already understood to be colonial, but then the question necessarily then becomes, is it, at some point, has it been the status quo for so long that there's leadership in place in some places who would rather just have things progress as they have been, since some countries have figured out, quite literally, how to survive under this mode of production, and necessarily upending things could possibly have a disproportionate effect. So like there seems to be that perspective, and there's obviously the more revolutionary perspective of like totally getting yourselves out from like this coercive economic relation. So like there's this move along to get along, mentality that he's like alluding to earlier. And then there's also like, what he's talking about in terms of like a united Africa that is totally free of this colonial relation that can then necessarily come together to do central planning. So that's another thing I think about as a barrier, quite literally being able to like get the leadership in enough African countries to agree with the perspective on what the route ought to be, since like, Africans are themselves or ourselves not a monolith. We're not a monolith. So like obviously I agree with Nkrumah, but the idea that we're, unanimously, in sync on the strategies and the goal is, to this point, not even in 2021, not yet bearing out in reality. Not to say that there isn't a lot of progress to be made, but there has been made, but there's still a lot more progress to be made. So like that's something I think about, in addition to the points you were making, Comrade Dictionary. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. Like, not everybody is going to agree on the right path, and that doesn't mean that they're like bad or wrong. Just people have they're coming at it from different angles. And I think too, it's worth thinking about that there are bound to be people in Africa who, well, I mean, think about like Wretched of the Earth and how much time Fanon spends talking about the native intellectual, right? There's going to be a whole class of people who are like, well, actually, it's better that we are working with the West because they give us all these benefits. Because there's a class of people, or at least a section of the populace, who does receive tangible benefits and their life is made better, and they can just sort of ignore or excuse like that it's bad for other people. Like they have those guys talking about how great French culture is and all that junk that they said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's worth thinking about, is that there are people who, and that's going to be true of socialism in the United States as well. There are people who will assuredly have a decline in their overall, I don't know, lifestyles. They will have less access to certain things than they did because they are absurdly rich now, and that will affect some people in Africa as well. But obviously, the benefits to the population as a whole are worth that. But it is
Mm-hmm.
a thing to think about and to talk about and to like, I don't know, I guess that's just something I've been thinking about, is like, how do you deal with all of these people who write think pieces about how it's good actually that bad things happen because some of us have good things. You know what I'm saying?
No, that makes perfect sense. Exactly. So one question that I thought was interesting to talk about before we read this last third is, so Aaron asks a good question about, the subject is new to me. Is the idea of African unification popular or even commonly considered throughout Africa? So I'm going to link this article from January. There's quite literally already a parliamentary body of different Pan-African, well, there's a parliamentary apparatus made up of different Pan-African bodies that already operates in the interest of Pan-Africanism. You should go ahead and read that when you have a chance. This one talks about, there are chaos that was unfolding over the continental body elections. So obviously we can't speak to like what the specific numbers in terms of like how many Africans support Pan-Africanism and a unified Africa, but Pan-Africanism itself being a global movement, you know, for Africans in Africa and across the diaspora, necessarily means that the answer is definitely yes. There's definitely a lot of widespread support all over the world for a unified Africa, you know, even if we don't know what those numbers are. And that's not even to say like we're the majority opinion, but we could be. Literally, how do you even get that kind of data? We'd have to take forward a program to present to our people internationally to see where the agreement even lies, you know? So let's see. So comrades, so she says they had the Pan-African Congress, so they were definitely attempting to get over that stumbling block. Yeah, exactly. There's the Pan-African Congress. There's like all kinds of like what's the word I'm looking for? Sects of Pan-African apparatuses, even in like different African countries, parliaments and different modes of government, to say nothing of the fact that there are still revolutionary minded African governments to this day in terms of countries like Mozambique, for example, where I've been. So yeah, there's a lot of support for the goal. Whether or not it's the majority right now is like not even unfortunately quantifiable by the just by literally like what it is you'd be asking people to gather the data on. It'd be a little bit unrealistic. Not to say that you were asking that or anything like that. Just saying like that'd be hard to quantify, but that we're everywhere is a good sign, you know. I think we could all agree on that.
Also, on that point,
Uh-huh.
the West had like a low-level sort of Libya bad, Gaddafi evil going for a long time. But once he started having success with a Pan-African movement, it was only then that Libya had to have a revolution, and
Mhm.
we had to establish a no-fly zone and all this other crap. So I think that speaks to me anyway that there really is a desire to see Pan-African unity.
Not only that, so I'm really glad you brought up Libya because like one thing, and I don't even remember what page it was on. Maybe I'd have to go back and find it. But there was something that was mentioned about like the freezing out of colonial powers that be from like different economic relations inside of Libya as long ago as the early 1900s. Let me see if I can quickly find reference to that real quick. But if I can't, I'll like I'll mention it on I'll find a time point for it and put it in the video when we upload it. But yeah, they like there was something here that had reminded me of the fact that like okay, so our like hatred of like Gaddafi and like the idea of like Libya tending towards any independence like didn't even start anytime anywhere near the time period with where he actually ended up being murdered. It was it was 70, 80 years, you know, before that, these kind of relations like developing over time, you know, this idea of like colonial powers trying to keep a stranglehold on these African countries, the African countries themselves operating in their own interest. And then when there seems to be actual progress being made materially for said African countries, them finally pulling the trigger on actual coups d'etats and assassinations of democratically elected leaders and things of that sort. Yeah, yeah. I had to figure out what it was that had triggered like those thoughts. But it was an interesting thing to think about. Like, wow, what happens to Gaddafi went back to like well before Gaddafi's time. You know, which is an interesting thing to think about. And like, you can see like when they must be desperate when they do stuff like that. They must feel the control slipping away to even feel like they have to necessarily go that far. Because in this year of our Lord 2021, they typically feel like they have to go a hell of a lot less far than actually like killing an African leader, any leader in the global South. You know, they always it seems as if they feel like they can necessarily leverage their position to get things going in the direction they want to go. And it makes you wonder what is their perception of events if they felt like they had to do what it is they ended up doing in terms of murdering Gaddafi, or at least funding that murder. That's a question for y'all to consider. What is like the perspective of what these different state apparatuses, what is their perspective on like just how quickly revolution and can break out and things can change? Because like they don't seem to have the doomer attitude about the possibility of successful revolution at all. They seem to totally operate from the standpoint that like it's not only possible, but it's likely if they don't continue to behave in the way that they behave. So like it seems like, you know, from a certain jaded standpoint, the damn State Department has more revolutionary optimism than the damn revolutionaries. That's why, you know. So that's interesting. Safety in numbers. And does anybody have some good sources to learn about what went on with Libya? I just remember the mainstream news. Yeah, I got a whole folder about Libya. Aaron, after this, just reach out to me so I don't forget, and I'll send you like, you know, everything that, well, not everything, but I'll send you some of the stuff that I have on Libya. But yeah.
Just really quick, a thing to think about too. Like, I don't know anything about the plane bombing in Scotland, but it's like a sort of like weird liberal thing that we've been taught all our lives, that like states are one thing or the other, people are one thing or the other. Like Stalin was a monster or whatever. Like that's not a good way to look at it. It's better to look at like maybe Gaddafi did some good things and maybe some bad things,
Mm-hmm.
and saying like Gaddafi was only bad or Libya was only a terrorist state or whichever is not a helpful way to look at things if you want to like dialectically understand the world around you. I think it's better to think like these decisions were good for this reason because they accomplished this. These decisions were bad because they led to these bad outcomes. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah. Because like, so I was just saying on Twitter the other day that there's like this super weird tendency to like totally try to make our goals a matter of like class interest and not a moral question, and like that we shouldn't do that because actually for the marginalized it is a moral question. And you know, if it's not a moral question for you, then you must not necessarily be all that materially impacted. But like that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't still class interest tied up into this moral question. So like we still have to like, so like for to go at what you were talking about, like the interesting question isn't to ask when Gaddafi gets assassinated by the logic of imperialism, oh, was he good or was he evil? Like, no, like that necessarily doesn't lead to any interesting conversation at all, you know, because whether or not he's personally good or personally evil is second to the question of what are the necessarily material conditions that end up leading to the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, and what does that say about where the class lie? What is the class perspective on these things? And those can be necessarily moral and strategic questions and questions of class issues at the same time, but framing it from the start as this moral question of, well, necessarily almost works backwards from the conclusion that like some of these imperialist assassinations are justified and some aren't, and it just depends on which leaders we like and dislike, which like ends up being an uninteresting conversation. But you know, Twitter and like other like, you know, subtler socialist type people love to have interesting conversations, you know. So it's that's a really good point for you to bring up, like the idea that we have to like make sure that we're analyzing these things dialectically in terms of like the actual events now, because the moral question is about the relation, and I guess to some extent the moral question is about the events, but like it's not just unfair that we're being exploited, it's also just, you know, it's unethical, it's unsustainable, and it's like, you know, it's just it's not right. And like this idea that you'll be able to win working class people over without like being able to make a strong appeal, you know, from a moral point of view is, yeah, good luck. You know, these are the same kind of folks who think that you can like win revolution without necessarily like appealing to the black church, for example. And here in the States, like, yeah, good luck. I would love to see a bunch of like white socialists try to win a revolution, try to build revolution without the black church. Like that would be hilarious. It's never gonna fucking happen, but that would be funny. So we got 7 pages left for chapter 2. Did anybody want to give it a stab besides Comrade Dictionary and myself? Was that making sense though, Comrade Dictionary?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. The urgent need to plan industrial development on a continental scale must not, however, blind us to the equally important need to do the same for agriculture, fishing, and forestry. Exactly, Comrade Sochi. If it was possible to get anything done in this country without the black church, it would have happened already. It's not going to ever fucking happen. The urgent need to plan industrial development on a continental scale must not, however, blind us to the equally important need to do the same for agriculture, fishing, and forestry. And the role of industry and development, some fallacies, Dudley Sears has pointed out the interdependence of agriculture and industry. Materials are needed for growing industries. More important, the swelling town labor force needs to be fed. And this implies that a rising surplus of food has to be produced in the countryside. To overemphasize industry, as some countries have found to their cost, leads paradoxically in the end to a slower rate of industrialization. African states are importing larger amounts of food than ever before from abroad. This trend must be stopped by a carefully planned expansion of our own agriculture. As an industry, there can be specialization so that each region or state concentrates on producing the agricultural products for which it is best suited. For instance, it is wasteful for each West African state to try to be self-sufficient in rice when Senegal's Casamance district would be well able to supply the need. Equally, Mali and the Upper Volta are obvious exporters of fresh, tinned, and processed meat, while coastal states would supply fresh, tinned, and smoked fish. And a further argument for a unified agricultural policy is implied in the need to step up efforts to combat many of the obstacles to economic growth. Locust, the tsetse fly, and plant diseases are no respectives of political frontiers. That's fair enough. Research into their control would benefit from a pooling of brain power and technical know-how. So also with medicine and social services. How much greater than a chance of wiping out major epidemic diseases into like river blindness and sleeping sickness if action against them is coordinated and unified. The advantage of unified military and diplomatic policies, both for our own security and to achieve freedom for every part of Africa, are so obvious as to need no comment. Comrade Dictionary, I'm going to expand your responsibilities. In addition to posting definitions, maybe when some stuff is like hard to pronounce, maybe you can get like the YouTube link in there for like the pronunciations and shit, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be cool. The advantage of unified military and diplomatic policies, both for our own security and to achieve freedom for every part of Africa, are so obvious as to need no comment. Transport and communications are also sectors where unified planning is needed. Roads, railways, waterways, airlines must be made to serve Africa's need, not the requirements of foreign interests. It's really interesting how he's just like both analytically like assessing the situation while at the same time like interweaving like a prescription like for the problem. Like he has a real talent for just like mixing the problem in with the solutions at the same time in a way that you don't often find. Like I really appreciate that. Communications between Africa's states are quite inadequate. In many cases, it is still easier to travel from an airport in Africa to Europe or America than to go from one African state to another. Economic unity, to be effective, must be accompanied by political unity. The two are inseparable, each necessary for the full future greatness of our continent and the full development of our resources. There are several examples of major unions of states in the world today. And Africa must unite. Well, that's another one we got to read in the work study eventually. And Africa must unite. I described some of the more important ones and warned against the danger of regional federations in Africa. Africa today is the main stamping ground of the neo-colonialist forces that seek the domination of the world for the imperialism they serve. Spreading from South Africa, the Congo, the Rhodesias, Angola, Mozambique, they form a maze-like connection with the mightiest international financial monopolies in the world. These monopolies are extending their banking and industrial organizations throughout the African continent. Their spokesmen push their interest in the parliaments and governments of the world and sit on the international bodies that are supposed to exist for the promotion of world peace, that are supposed to exist for the promotion of world peace and the welfare of the less developed countries. Yeah, because that's totally what they exist to do, huh? Against such a formidable phalanx of forces, how can we move? Certainly not. I know, but it is still a negotiation between unequal powers. Just wary is all. Fair enough. But against such a formidable phalanx of forces, how can we move? Certainly not singly, but in a combination that will give strength to our bargaining power and eliminate so many of the duplications that give greater force and greater advantage to the imperialists in their strategy of neocolonialism. Decolonization is a word much and unctuously used by imperialist spokesmen to describe the transfer of political control from colonialists to African sovereignty. The motive spring of colonialism, however, still controls the sovereignty. The young countries are still the providers of raw materials, the old of manufactured goods. Huh. So, like young countries have to give up stuff before they've even developed anything, and then old countries who have got the chance to develop stuff end up having to export that out. That's interesting. Comrade Dictionary posted the definition of unctuous in the chat, and it is excessively or ingratiatingly flattering. Thank you, Comrade Dictionary. You are an esteemed book of knowledge. The motive spring of colonialism, however, still controls the sovereignty. The young countries are still the providers of raw materials, the old of manufactured goods. The change in the economic relationship between the new sovereign states and the erstwhile masters is only one form. Colonialism has achieved a new guise. It has become neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Its final bid for existence as monopoly capitalism or imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. And neo-colonialism is fast entrenching itself within the body of Africa today through the consortia and monopoly combinations that are the carpetbaggers of the African revolt against colonialism and the urge for continental unity. These interests are centered on the mining companies of South and Central Africa. For mining, they ramify into an involved pattern of investments, companies, manufacturing concerns, transport, public utility organizations, oil and chemical industries, nuclear installations, and many other undertakings too numerous to mention. Their enterprises spill across the vast African continent and over the oceans into North America, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, the Caribbean, South America, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and most of Western Europe. Connections, direct and indirect, are maintained with many of the giants of American industry and finance. Let's see. They are supported by leading bankers, financiers, and industrialists in the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Germany, America, and elsewhere. The rotas of their directorates are filled with names that have a familiar ring for those who have the least knowledge of international finance and industry. Names like Oppenheimer, Hamdel, Drayton, Rothschild, Gerlanger, Gillette, Lafond, Robillard, Van der Straten, Hochschild, Chester Beatty, Patino, Engelhard, Timmons are ubiquitous. Ubiquitous. I don't know. That's always been a rough one for me. Others equally powerful in the interest they dominate avoid the publicity of lengthy list of their directorships, either by complete absence from the pages of directories, anxious to advertise their glories, or by coyly hiding their eminence behind a lonely announcement with name and address. Ubiquitous. There you go. I got you. Appreciate it. Or being fool if you like. Fair enough. All right. These intricate interconnections of the greatest imperialist monopolies expose the real forces that are behind world events. They indicate also the pattern which links those events to the developing countries at different points of the globe. They reveal the duality of the interests that force the developing countries to import goods and services, which are the products of companies combined into monopoly groups directly exploiting their natural resources or intimately associated with them. This is the double edge to the guillotine that cuts off Africa's wealth from Africa, to the greater enrichment of the countries which absorb her primary materials and return them to her in the form of finished products. Ubiquitous, appearing, present, appearing, or found everywhere. Makes sense to me. In their newfound independence, it is to these very same monopolistic groups that the new African states are obliged to turn to supply the requirements arising from the need to lay the foundations for their economic transformation. The policy of non-alignment, whenever it is exercised, imposes the obligation to shop around, but since capitalism has come to the peak of monopoly, it is impossible for any of us to avoid dealing with monopoly in some form or another. But it is in the nature of our arrangements with the monopolies that the freedom or otherwise of the African states lies. Where we establish and maintain the integrity of our financial institutions and keep our basic projects free from imperialist control, we leave ourselves room to maneuver away from the neo-colonialism that unfortunately has closed its grip upon countries whose independence is overshadowed by a heavy reliance upon extra African associations. In this atmosphere of relative freedom, the government or the giant combines that open up industrial enterprises on our soil do so on arrangements that are well screened and are part of nationally planned advancement. The national banks, got 4 pages left, y'all, for chapter 2. The national banks are really national banks, formed and run out of the country's own resources, and our other financial and economic institutions are guarded against neo-colonialist infiltration. Unhappily, these conditions are rare in Africa. Most of the territories pass into the state of national sovereignty and unviable circumstances that inhibit even a modicum of free movement within national limits. They could be overcome, but only within the combined strength that continental unity and a central connective socialist policy, free of attachments to other continents, could give. As things are, most of our new states alarmed at the prospect of the harsh world of poverty, disease, ignorance, and lack of financial and technical resources into which they are thrust from the womb of colonialism, are reluctant to cut the cord that holds them to the imperialist mother. Their hesitancy is fostered by the sugared water of aid, which is the stopgap between avid hunger and the hope for greater nourishment that never comes. As a result, we find that imperialism, having quickly adopted its outlook to the loss of direct political control, has retained and extended its economic grip, and thereby its political compulsion by the artfulness of neo-colonialist insinuation. Yeah, I have noticed that, like, the colonialists are really good at making, like, real-time adjustments as, like, the situation necessarily shifts in a way that the class overall could, like, stand to learn from. So that's a good point that he's bringing up when he says, we find that imperialism, having quickly adopted its outlook to the loss of direct political control, like that's powerful. The increasing expansion of productive capacity and potential output of the advanced capitalist countries has its corollary in the necessity to export on a geometrically increasing scale the finished products of the industry and the excess capital that could only further inflate competition at home, but brings rapid and high returns from the industrially starved new nations. Hence, the fevered jostling for position in these areas, as well as in that of raw materials monopoly, which in using Africa as the playground, not only of the Cold War, an aspect of the fight of capitalism for existence against socialism, but of the competitive struggle of international monopoly. North American imports into Africa rose from 10 to 3% in 1959 to 13.7% in 1962, while those from other Western countries and Japan remained the same or declined slightly. This corresponds to the increasing American investments in the continent's extractive industries and the growth of United States participation in financial establishments on this continent. Okay, 3 pages left. American banking houses are making inroads into territories formerly catered for solely by European and British banks. The French banks still dominate in the former French countries and the Belgians in the Congo, but this is frequently a front for American participation. European financial advisors constantly counsel the African countries on the advantages that they can receive from remaining in association with the erstwhile mother country, depreciating the possibilities of inter-African association. Much subtlety is employed by Lombard, the commentator of the Financial Times. In an article which appeared in the issue of February 6, 1964, of this influential London newspaper, a product of the Industrial Holding Company, which also produces The Economist, Lombard asserted that there is, quote, not much that African countries can do to directly help one another financially at this stage of their economic evolution. He is therefore glad to see that the independent African countries are now coming to recognize that it is very much in their own interest to preserve the monetary ties with leading European countries they inherited from their colonial days. They obviously entertain strong suspicion that the enthusiasm their old mother countries were displaying for allowing them to remain within their. He is therefore glad to see that the independent African countries are now coming to recognize that it is very much in their own interest to preserve the monetary ties which with leading European countries they inherited from the colonial days. They obviously entertain strong suspicions that the enthusiasm their old mother countries were displaying for allowing them to remain within their monetary areas were motivated largely, if not wholly, by consideration of self-interest. And they are inclined to assume that this implied that their own purpose would be served best by following up political independence with this financial equivalent at the earliest possible opportunity. Yeah. Lombard assured his readers that so I think like my brain just like made this like jump in terms of just like connecting like this dot between what Fanon was writing about in Wretched of the Earth and what Nkrumah is writing about here. Because Fanon in Wretched of the Earth was directly talking about this idea that like though Africans mourn the old relation to the land, colonization has created a context in which we cannot return to the old relation. And we, as such, must engage with the world as it is as it has become under the development of neo-colonialism and imperialism. And moving forward with our liberation along this material context. And then in Nkrumah here, along those same lines, mentions above, what was the quote? He says that he's recognizing very much in their own interest to preserve the monetary ties with leading European countries they inherited from their colonial days. And I'm like, oh, okay. So like it's not again a moral question. It's this is the situation we find ourselves in materially, and we have to engage along these lines. We quite literally have no time for idealism, because of course we would like to not have to work with any kind of European finance capital, but it is better than having no development at all. And if like the facilitation of development necessarily means having an economic relationship with colonizers, then that is better than the alternative, which is quite literally extinction of African people across the diaspora, and especially across the actual continent. That's powerful shit. And obviously, I don't even know if they were like in sync, but like it lets you know that like at least Africans on entertaining colonization were coming to a lot of the same conclusions when these men lived. Like that's powerful to me. That's real powerful. Okay, so Lombard assured his readers that the Africans showed wisdom when the Secretariat of ECA, assisting the Organization of African Unity to implement its resolution on the possibility of establishing an African clearinghouse and payments union, had the good sense to seek the advice of the distinguished American Monetary Authority. Professor Triffin of Yale University, need we be surprised that in his report, the distinguished American professor pointed out that, quote, it would be most unwise lightly to condemn or break up financial arrangements with major trading companies and financial centers. This, of course, we might consider neo-colonialist penetration. But to Lombard, it is only one side of the picture. For there are two worlds, and the African countries should now strive to get the best of both worlds by maintaining and even further developing the relations they have with the major international monetary areas, and at the same time building their own financial self-help mechanism. However, it is possible to resolve two contradictions Lombard does not volunteer to explain. or how it is possible to resolve two contradictions Lombard does not volunteer to explain. But what he does confess is that this unresolvable two-way procedure would meet with nothing but the fullest approval from their African present monetary area associates. This says plenty, and we have no difficulty in believing what it says. For the simple fact is that those who control the major international monetary areas are placing their time bombs within the self-help mechanisms of the African countries. For these mechanisms are controlled by the financial monopolist of imperialism, the bankers and financiers who have been very busy in the past few years setting up establishments throughout Africa, infiltrating into the economic heart of many countries and linking with the most important enterprises that are being established to exploit the continent's natural resources on a larger scale than ever before their own private gain. Though the aim of the neo-colonialists is economic domination, they do not confine their operations to the economic sphere. They use the old colonialist methods of religious, educational, and cultural infiltration. For example, in the independent states, many expatriate teachers and cultural ambassadors influence the minds of the young against their own country and people. They do this by undermining confidence in the national government and social system through exalting their own nations of how a state should be run and forget that there is no monopoly of political wisdom. But all this indirect subversion is as nothing compared with the brazen onslaught of international capitalism. Here is empire, the empire of finance capital. If, in fact, if not in name, a vast sprawling network of intercontinental activity on a highly diversified scale that controls the lives of millions of people in the most widely separated parts of the world, manipulating whole industries and exploiting the labor and riches of nations for the greedy satisfaction of a few. Here resides the mainspring of power, the direction of policies that stand against the advancing tide of freedom and the exploited people of Africa and the world. Here is the adamantine enemy of African independence and unity, braced in an international chain of common interests that regards the likely coming together of the new nations as a major blow at its continued domination of the resources and economies of others. Here indeed are the real workings of neo-colonialism. Here indeed are the economic ramifications of the monopolies and combines. Their financial and economic empires are pan-African, and they can only be challenged as on a pan-African basis. Only a united Africa through an all-African Union government can defeat them. That's chapter 2, y'all. We did it. So, adamantine means unbreakable, according to the esteemed Comrade Dictionary's definition. Yeah, I remember in a D&D context, adamantine armor is what makes you immune from the effects of a natural 20 or a critical hit. So, it meaning unbreakable and like knowing that it exists in that context, that makes me chuckle. So let's talk about it a little bit before we wrap up. So y'all were talking in the chat. Let's see what you guys had to discuss in the chat. You were so Elijah and our comrade Aaron here, they were talking about whether or not the relationship between Africa and China is non-coercive at all. And Aaron was suggesting that possibly it's less coercive or even significantly less coercive, but that there might be a power imbalance that necessarily means that, by the way power works, that it's somewhat coercive, which is a point I would need to meditate on to think about it because it makes a lot of sense. And he said, and then Comrade Elijah says, or Comrade Soshi says, this is what China is doing now, and it is going to be so significant in having independence from Western nations and to build up their own productive forces. And so he links to a short little snippet from an article that says transport and communications are also sectors where unified planning is needed. Roads, railways, waterways, airlines must be made to serve Africa's needs, not the requirements of foreign interest. Oh, that's from this past chapter. Yeah, he's pointing out how that's what China's doing now, and Aaron's talking about. Yeah, of course that's the case, but there's still a negotiation between unequal powers, and we should be wary, of course, because there's still capitalists inside the country who have their own interest, but The question then becomes: is there a strong enough apparatus in place in China to keep the capitalist in place? And then that is your opinion on that question, and then informs every other take that you might possibly have. So that's a really good discussion y'all were having. So she says, but this is frequently a front for American participation. What does this mean? That the Belgian, French, and British banks are providing inroads for Americans to take over the financialization of those markets? Yeah, that's exactly what that means. You were about to say something, comrade?
I was going to say the China talk, like it's the same sort of thing as what was just being talked about at the end of this chapter. Even if the Chinese investment in Africa is all bad, and I don't think that, but even if it was, it's still the better deal than most of these countries were able to get elsewhere. So it's like, it's not really a choice, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like a thing that must be done.
Yeah. Like, so near the end of the chapter, and I think Aaron seemed to be agreeing with basically exactly what you're saying. I mean, they said verbatim, yeah, it's the best deal that Africa has been offered so far. But so what? One of the things they were specifically mentioning, and I was just bringing it up when I was making the comp between Fanon, Wretched of the Earth commentary on this kind of thing, and Nkrumah's here, is this idea that they're like accepting the material reality, and they're thinking like it's unwise of them to disengage from the global economy and to like cut themselves off monetarily when they might be able to necessarily benefit from both worlds. And they are coming to these conclusions in a pre-China world where China has not yet come to be the great economic power that they come to do. So like for them, it must be something close to a no-brainer to just go ahead and like build this relationship with China in a way that necessarily means that you can like get way closer to like getting yourself out from the colonial construct altogether. If you can enjoy the same or as more of a material context by entering into negotiations with these people, in this case with the Chinese government, with the CPC, why the hell wouldn't you do that? You know, that's the best chance. That's the best that they've been presented so far in terms of the idea of eventually getting out from under any kind of colonialism at all. So, and I mean, and because who knows what their perspectives are from country to country, from leader to leader, about what they even think China's intentions are here. But at the very least, China does not seem to be trying to coerce any African nation into having a relationship with it. And from the perspective of African, if you got to choose between the continued relation with European finance capital and Chinese finance capital, like that's that's just an open 3-pointer in the fucking finals. You're gonna take that shit all day, you know. So yeah, that's a good point that y'all are bringing up. So yeah, we got through, and I want to develop that idea more as we get through these readings as well. So we got through chapter 2. We'll start chapter 3 next week. Let's see if chapter 3 is going to be short enough to do in one sitting. Yeah, no, it's only like 16 pages. It looks like basically all of these, some more than others, but all of them are short enough to finish in one sitting. Judging just based on like some quick math, it might take us like another 2.5 months to finish this at our current pace, but that's fine by me. We're getting through it at a good pace so far. We've already finished 2 chapters in as many weeks. We'll definitely be able to go from page 37 to page 52 next week. That ain't no big deal at all. So until the end, we got Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa tomorrow at noon. We got 8 o'clock Wednesday, EST still, for Angela Davis's Women Racing Class. And of course, we're continuing our Parenti reading at 5 EST as well. Until then, I'll see y'all tomorrow. I love y'all, comrades. Solidarity always. Y'all take care.